In the first week of June 1944, the largest invasion force ever assembled sat waiting along the southern coast of England. Nearly 7,000 ships, thousands of aircraft, more than 150,000 men packed into landing craft and crowded staging camps, briefed, armed and ready to cross the English Channel and tear open the Second Front against Nazi Germany. Everything had been planned. The beaches were chosen. The tides were calculated. The airborne drops were mapped to the minute. Years of preparation, oceans of steel, and the fate of the war in the West all pointed toward a single stretch of French coastline. And then it all stopped. Not because of the German army, not because of a leaked secret or a broken plan. It stopped because of the sky. The one thing no general could command, no army could conquer, and no plan could control was the weather over the Channel. And in that first week of June, the weather was turning against them. What happened next came down to a handful of men in a country house in England, bent over weather maps by lamplight, arguing over a forecast that none of them could be certain of. One report, one judgment. One narrow window that the enemy never saw coming. This is the story of how a single weather forecast saved the largest invasion in history from catastrophe. To understand it, we have to look at the men who made that forecast. The bitter feud that almost tore them apart. The enemy who read the same sky and guessed wrong, and the storm that arrived just 2 weeks later and proved how close it all came to ruin. But how does an operation this vast, planned in this much detail, end up a prisoner of the weather in the first place? The answer lies in a set of conditions so specific that only a few days in the entire month would do. The invasion, code-named Operation Overlord, needed nature to cooperate in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. First, it needed moonlight. Thousands of paratroopers and glider troops were to drop behind German lines in darkness, hours before the seaborne landings. Their pilots needed a late-rising full moon to find their drop zones over the fields and hedgerows of Normandy. Second, it needed a low tide at first light. All along the coast, the German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had planted hundreds of thousands of obstacles below the high water mark. Steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, iron gates, mines fixed to posts, all built to rip open landing craft before they ever reached the sand. Allied engineers had to come in at low tide when those obstacles stood exposed, so they could blast paths through them for the waves of men behind. Third, it needed calm. The landing craft were flat-bottomed and low in the water. In heavy seas they would swamp, capsize or scatter, and men already sick and soaked would be tipped into deep water under fire. The battleships needed clear sightlines to hit the coastal batteries, and the bombers needed to see the ground beneath them. Put all of that together, and the window shrank to almost nothing. The moon and the tides only aligned for a few days each month. In June of 1944, that meant the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. Miss those 3 days, and the next time the moon and the tides lined up again would not come for roughly 2 more weeks, around the 19th of June. Eisenhower did not choose those dates. Nature chose them for him. He commanded the greatest army ever gathered in the West, but he could not move the moon or hold back the tide. He was chained to a calendar written by the sea. And that left one variable no one could predict with any certainty: the weather. Today we take the forecast for granted. We glance at a screen and see the whole week laid out. In 1944, there were no weather satellites, no radar picture of the ocean. Forecasters worked from scattered reports, readings taken from ships, from aircraft, from lonely stations far out on the edge of the map, plotted by hand onto charts, and then read almost like tea leaves by men who knew the Atlantic could turn in a matter of hours. Forecasting more than a day or two ahead was closer to an art than a science, and everyone in the business knew it. So the invasion that would decide the fate of Europe rested on the least certain thing in the entire plan. And in the opening days of June, the charts were filling with something no one wanted to see. A chain of storms marching in off the Atlantic, aimed straight at the Channel. The man who had to carry that uncertainty was a tall, serious Scot named James Stagg. Group Captain Stagg was the chief weather advisor at Allied headquarters, and his job was, on paper, close to impossible. Every day, and eventually several times a day, he had to walk into a room full of generals and admirals, men like Eisenhower and Montgomery, and give them one clear answer about what the sky would do. Not a range, not a maybe. A verdict they could act on, knowing that thousands of lives hung on whether he had read it right. But Stagg did not make that forecast alone. And that was the heart of the problem. Behind him stood 3 separate forecasting teams, and they did not agree on how to read the weather at all. There was the British Meteorological Office team, which included a brilliant Norwegian named Sverre Petterssen, who used the physics of moving air masses to push the forecast forward in time. There was the Royal Navy's own team at the Admiralty, and there was the American team, led by a confident forecaster named Irving Krick, who relied on what was called the analog method, matching the current weather to similar patterns pulled from years of historical records and betting that history would repeat itself. These were some of the finest weather minds of their generation. Put them on the same problem, and they routinely arrived at completely different answers. The Americans under Krick leaned toward optimism. The British team, and Petterssen in particular, were often far more cautious. When the maps were quiet, those disagreements barely mattered. But as the invasion drew close and the weather grew unstable, the gap between them cracked open into a running battle. They fought it out over the telephone, voices crackling down bad wartime lines, each team defending its own reading of the very same charts. And Stagg sat in the middle of it, forced to take their clashing forecasts and boil them down into a single sentence for the Supreme Commander. Think about the weight of that. If Stagg hedged, if he handed the generals a fog of maybes, they could not act. If he sounded confident and turned out wrong, men would die on the beaches or drown in the surf because of his mistake. Every forecast he delivered was a gamble with other people's lives, and the men on the other end of that telephone line could not even agree on what they were seeing. And as the first days of June arrived, the gamble only got worse. The charts were turning ugly. Those Atlantic depressions were rolling in exactly as feared, dragging high winds, low cloud, and rough seas toward the very coast where the invasion was meant to land. The provisional date was locked. The invasion would go on the 5th of June. The ships had begun to load. Some were already moving toward their positions, and James Stagg was about to walk into a room and tell the most senior commanders in the Western world that the sky was about to betray them. On the weekend before the invasion, the forecasters looked at their charts and saw disaster coming. The picture was grim on every table. A deep area of low pressure was driving toward the British Isles, and behind it came more. For the 5th of June, the day the entire invasion had been built around, the forecast was brutal. Strong winds, a low ceiling of cloud that would blind the bombers and hide the drop zones. Seas rough enough to swamp the landing craft long before they reached the shore. Late on the 4th of June, Stagg brought that forecast to Eisenhower and his commanders. The room was tense. Outside, the evening was still deceptively mild, which made the warning even harder to swallow. But Stagg held his line. The 5th of June would be no day to cross the Channel. For Eisenhower, it was an agonizing moment. Tens of thousands of men were already briefed and sealed into their ships. Some vessels had even put to sea, beginning the long approach to Normandy. Every hour of delay chewed away at the secrecy that made surprise possible, and at the nerves of men crammed below decks, seasick and waiting. Wait too long, and the Germans might uncover what was coming. Sail too soon into that weather, and the invasion could drown before it began. Eisenhower made the call. He postponed. The assault set for the 5th would wait 24 hours. Orders raced out to the fleet. Ships that had already sailed had to swing around in worsening seas and fight their way back to port, some of them battling through the leading edge of the very storm the forecasters had promised. It was a miserable, dangerous maneuver carried out under a blanket of secrecy, and it worked only because the warning had come in time. And then the storm arrived. On the 5th of June, the weather over the Channel turned exactly as savage as Stagg had said it would. High winds tore across the water. The sea heaved. Any fleet caught crossing that day would have been scattered and hammered. The landings a slaughter or an outright failure before a single beach was taken. The postponement had almost certainly saved the invasion from destroying itself. But saving the 5th created a far worse problem, because now Eisenhower was trapped. If the 6th was also unfit, the iron rules of the moon and the tide gave him no easy second chance. He would have to freeze everything, roll the entire invasion back, and wait until the middle of the month, around the 19th of June, for the conditions to return. 2 more weeks of 150,000 men sealed inside their ships and camps. 2 more weeks for a secret this enormous to spring a leak. 2 more weeks for the Germans to finish their defenses and puzzle out the target. The whole operation was balanced on a knife's edge, and it all came back to one question that only the weathermen could answer. Was there any way at all, any window, any gap, that the invasion could go on the 6th of June? On the evening of the 4th of June, while the storm built outside, the forecasters bent over their charts and found something. It was faint, it was risky, but it was there. Behind the storm, now driving toward the channel, a ridge of higher pressure was forming and beginning to nose in from the west. If the timing held, it would shove the worst of the weather through and open a gap. Not clear skies, not gentle summer seas, but a lull, a break of roughly a day and a half, falling across the 6th of June when the winds might ease and the cloud might lift just enough for the invasion to go. This was the turn the whole war in the West had been waiting for, and it rested on the thinnest scraps of evidence. The reports feeding those charts came from a scatter of sources spread across the ocean. Weather stations in Iceland and Greenland. Ships far out in the Atlantic. Aircraft flying long, lonely patrols over empty water. From those fragments, the forecasters had to project a break 2 days into the future, over the single most important stretch of 48 hours of the century. The team still did not fully agree on how solid that break would be. Some read it as a genuine window, others feared it was too short, too uncertain to stake an entire invasion on. But Stagg, weighing all of it against his own judgment, came to believe the gap was real. On the evening of the 4th, he carried that cautious hope into the commanders' meeting. He told Eisenhower that a break appeared to be coming, that the 6th of June might just be possible. It was not a promise, it was a forecaster's careful judgment, offered with every ounce of uncertainty it carried. But it was enough for Eisenhower to lean toward going, and to give a tentative order to prepare. Then came the final meeting, in the small hours of the 5th of June. The scene has become legendary, and for good reason. Outside the windows of the headquarters at Southwick House, the storm was still screaming. Rain lashed the glass, wind roared through the trees. It looked and sounded like the last possible night on Earth to launch anything across open water. And into that room, with the gale hammering the building, Stagg walked in and told the assembled commanders that the break was coming, that the storm would ease, that the 6th of June would hand them their window. It was an extraordinary thing to say while the weather raged against the walls. Everything the men could see and hear told them the forecaster had lost his mind. Everything on the charts told him he was right. Eisenhower went around the room. His air commander worried about the cloud over the drop zones. His naval commander was ready. Montgomery, commanding the ground forces, said go. But in the end, no committee could make this choice. It belonged to one man, and every eye in the room turned to him. Eisenhower sat quietly for a long moment. Then he gave the order that launched the invasion of Europe. According to those who were there, he said it in only a handful of words. Okay, let us go. With that, the largest amphibious assault in history was set in motion on the strength of a single forecast that the weather itself seemed to be screaming against. Through the rest of that night and into the morning, the machine came to life. Across southern England, engines turned over, anchors lifted. The vast fleet began to push out into the grey, still heaving channel, following the narrow path the forecast had promised. Overhead, transport planes packed with paratroopers droned toward the French coast beneath a moon that came and went behind torn cloud. Every man aboard was trusting his life to a break in the weather he could not see and had never even been told about. They were about to land on a coast that, thanks to that same weather, was not ready for them. If you are finding this as gripping as I do, take a moment to subscribe. This channel brings the hidden turning points of the Second World War back to life, the quiet decisions and near disasters that most accounts pass over in a single line. It helps more than you know, and there is far more of this story still to come. Because while Eisenhower agonized in that storm-battered house in England, something was unfolding on the other side of the channel that would decide everything. The Germans were watching the same sky, they were reading the same storm, and they came to the exact opposite conclusion. On paper, the German army in France should have held every advantage. They knew an invasion was coming somewhere. They had spent years turning the coastline into a fortress of concrete and steel, the Atlantic Wall bristling with guns, bunkers, and Rommel's endless fields of beach obstacles. They had veteran divisions in reserve, and they had their own weather forecasters studying the channel just as closely as the Allies were. But the Germans were reading the sky with one eye closed. The reason came down to information. Weather in the North Atlantic moves, in general, from west to east. It rolls off the ocean toward Europe. Whoever holds the western approaches, the ships, the aircraft, the far-flung stations out in that empty water, sees the weather first and sees it clearest. And by 1944, the Allies had swept the Germans almost entirely off the Atlantic. German weather ships had been hunted down. Their long-range reconnaissance was thin and shrinking. The observations they would have needed to spot a break coming from the west simply were not reaching them. So when the June storm swept in, the German forecasters saw the storm, but not the gap behind it. They looked at the heaving channel and the filthy sky and reached a conclusion that seemed obvious. No one would be mad enough to launch an invasion into this. Their assessment in early June was that the weather ruled out any landing for days to come. And here is where the forecast did its real work. The very same weather that Stagg had read as a narrow window, the Germans read as a locked door. One side saw a way through, the other saw only the storm. And acting on that belief, the German command did the most dangerous thing an army expecting an invasion can possibly do. It relaxed. Senior officers, convinced nothing could happen, made other plans. A number of them were due to travel inland for a war game, an exercise built around, of all things, defeating an invasion. And the most important commander of all, the man who had built those very defenses, decided the moment was quiet enough to leave. Erwin Rommel climbed into his staff car and drove back to Germany. The weather, he was certain, guaranteed him a few quiet days. He wanted to be home for his wife's birthday, which fell on the 6th of June, and to press Hitler in person for more tanks. The general, whose entire strategy was to smash the invasion on the beaches in its first hours, chose those exact hours to be hundreds of miles away, at home. It was a decision that looked perfectly reasonable in the moment, and it would haunt the German command for the rest of the war. Someone on the German side might have questioned it. No one did. The forecast, in their reading, had settled the matter. So as the Allied fleet crept across the channel in the dark, guided by a break their own weathermen had found and the enemy's had missed, the coast of Normandy waited in a false and fatal calm. Guns that should have been fully crewed sat at reduced watch. Commanders who should have been at their posts were on the road, or asleep in distant billets. The most heavily defended coastline in the world had, for a few crucial hours, let down its guard because it trusted a forecast that could not see the whole sky. When the paratroopers began to spill out of the darkness, and the first grey shapes of thousands of ships loomed out of the mist off the beaches, the defenders were caught in exactly the state the Allies had prayed for. Surprised, leaderless in places. A step behind from the very first minute. That is what a single weather report brought. Not merely a day when the invasion could go. A day when the enemy was certain it could not. For years afterward, people would call the 6th of June a triumph of planning, and it was. But it was also a razor-thin escape, and just how thin only became clear 2 weeks later. Remember the trap Eisenhower had faced. If he had missed the window on the 5th, 6th, and 7th, the next time the tides and the moon aligned would arrive around the 19th of June. That was the fallback. That was where the invasion would have gone if the forecasters had lost their nerve, or if Eisenhower had held out for a safer, clearer picture that was never going to come. On the 19th of June, one of the worst storms to strike the channel in decades came roaring in. It blew for days. The seas rose into a fury that stopped operations cold. Off Omaha Beach, the Allies had towed out and assembled an artificial harbor, a vast improvised port built from concrete and steel to land supplies until a real port could be captured. The storm ripped it apart. Landing craft were smashed and flung ashore by the hundreds. The flow of men, ammunition, and fuel across the beaches was choked down to a trickle at the worst imaginable moment. Now picture that storm falling not on an army already ashore and dug in, but on the invasion itself. The fleet caught in mid-crossing, landing craft foundering far from shore. Paratroopers scattered across Normandy in gale-force winds. The entire delicate machinery of the largest amphibious operation in history thrown into chaos by weather that no gun and no general could fight. That is the disaster the forecast prevented. Stagg and the men beside him had not simply found a good day. They had threaded the invasion through the eye of a needle between two storms, launching it in the one narrow break before the weather slammed shut again for weeks. And it is worth stopping to remember what all of this meant for the men who never knew any of it was happening. In the landing craft that morning were tens of thousands of soldiers, packed shoulder to shoulder, soaked, frozen, and violently seasick from the heavy swell that the break had calmed but never erased. Most of them had no idea how close they had come to being sent on the 5th, into a storm that would have drowned them before they ever saw the shore. They had no idea that their lives had turned on a Scottish forecaster's reading of a pressure ridge far out over the Atlantic. They simply climbed down the nets, dropped into the boats, and went, trusting that the men above them had chosen the day well. Stagg himself carried the weight of that choice for the rest of his life. He understood, better than anyone, how uncertain the forecast had truly been, how easily the break could have failed to arrive, how many would have died if he had read the charts wrong. He had given his best honest judgment into a room of desperate men, and the sky had held. But he never once pretended it had been a sure thing. Eisenhower understood it too. In the hours before the landings, he quietly wrote out a short message to be released if the invasion failed. In it, he took the blame entirely on himself. He said the troops had done everything that courage and duty could do, and that if any fault was found in the attempt, it belonged to him alone. He put the note away in his wallet and carried it with him through the days that followed. He never had to use it. But the fact that he wrote it at all tells you just how close to the edge the whole thing truly stood. In the end, the invasion of Europe is remembered for the courage on the beaches, and it should be. For the men who ran into the guns at Omaha, who dropped into the dark over Normandy, who climbed the cliffs under fire. That courage decided the day, but behind all of it stood a quieter kind of courage and a stranger kind of power. The mightiest armies in history had gathered on that coast. Between them, they had battleships, bombers, tanks, and millions of men. And yet the single factor that decided when the blow would fall and whether it would land in triumph or in catastrophe was not a weapon at all. It was a handful of men reading the sky and a break in the weather that one side could see and the other could not. Information about the wind and the sea had become as decisive as steel. The Allies opened the second front partly because they could read the Atlantic and the Germans could not. They saw a door where the enemy saw a wall. And a single forecast, delivered with honesty and open uncertainty into a room full of doubt, sent the invasion through it at the only moment it could have gone. Erwin Rommel once said that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive, that it would be, for the Allies and the Germans alike, the longest day. He was right. But he spent the first of those hours at home because he had trusted a forecast that could not see the whole sky. That is how a single weather report saved the largest invasion in history. Not with a weapon and not with a battle plan, but with the willingness of one man to look at a storm, see the break hidden behind it, and stake the fate of the war on being right.